Welcome to the Corporate Director Podcast, where we discuss the experiences and ideas behind what's working in corporate board governance in our digital tech-fueled world. Here, you'll discover new insights from corporate leaders and governance researchers with compelling stories about corporate governance, strategy, board culture, risk management, digital transformation, and more.
Hi, everybody, and welcome back to the Corporate Director Podcast, the voice of modern governance. My name is Dottie Schindlinger, Executive Director of the Diligent Institute, and I'm joined by my co-host, Meghan Day, Principal Solution Designer at Diligent, and our special guest, TK Kerstetter, retired governance guru, longtime friend of the pod, for our annual end-of-the-year special episode. Meghan, TK, how are you doing?
Looking forward to the holidays.
Yeah, and great to be reunited here.
Well, I'm so excited to have TK back on the show. TK, thank you so much for agreeing to come back and do this again. Now that you're retired, how's that going?
Well, let's just say I have a little extra time to do stuff, but I'm excited that Megan's back too after having her little munchkin, and now the trio is back together, so we can really nail this year.
Yeah, the band is back together. I love it. Well, listen, we're going to go back and start, as we always do with our end of year episode, on our 2024 predictions. And last year, of course, we were joined by Rachel Simon, our former host. So Meghan, maybe we'll ask you to comment on Rachel's pick from last year. But TK, you and I had the same pick. Your pick was that AI, especially generative AI, was going to be the biggest challenge for the board. And I kind of agreed with you. I said it was going to be all things AI, that we really have yet to see how AI was going to impact boardrooms. I don't know. What do you think, TK? Do we both get A's?
Well, I'm not sure. Yes, I might give us A's. I mean, a monkey could have picked AI last year. So that, it's interesting. I think you could have said cyber risk, and that certainly was a yearly, all year issue and stuff. So, but if you're just saying, did we hit the nail on the head with AI? Yeah, and I'm not sure that you couldn't say it again this year. So it's something that's added along with cyber. It's another thing that's very difficult for the board to get their arms around.
For sure. And I will say, I mean, I went to many, many conferences and gatherings of directors this year, and there wasn't a single session at a single conference where AI didn't come up. It didn't matter what the topic was. It still came up. It was the hottest thing to talk about everywhere in every forum this year. And, kind of no surprise there, right? It is rocking the business world in many, many ways. But Meghan, I'd love to have you comment a little bit on Rachel's pick, because this was an election year. And her pick was that it was going to be sort of a careful or awkward dance of corporations and politics, and maybe some increase in activism on lobbying and campaign contribution transparency. Do you have any reflections on that pick?
Yeah, so I actually did my homework here because I wanted to see if what Rachel thought came true. And interestingly, I think, and similar to ESG, support for political activity related proposals on the shareholder side, it really dropped this year, especially when you look at the peak sort of in the height of the COVID movement. But I do think, on the other hand, there is some new data that shows that lobbying transparency proposals have maintained support. But what I think is really interesting, there's some new ISS research that shows some new interest in seeking global transparency in political spending outside of the US. Now, that is a trend I think we could potentially keep our eyes on.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting observation. TK, do you have any thoughts about the, Rachel's pick and whether or not that was a big trend?
Yeah, I just think that I am not surprised at the campaign contribution stuff, because I have seen very little discussion on it, and maybe it's because the other topics were so dominant, which sometimes happen when you have big other issues, that things sort of get pushed to the side a little bit. So that part of it doesn't surprise me. The awkward dance on politics was true. I mean, people were were dancing all around, wondering what was going to happen. So, yeah. So we'll give her a B plus on that.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. There definitely was a lot of, I mean, obviously, politics dominated the news cycle for what felt like our whole lives last year. So, especially those of us who happened to be in the state of Pennsylvania and couldn't get away from a political ad for more than 3 seconds. But, honestly, what was kind of interesting to me was to see how little was being said publicly by companies on the election. That seemed like, to Megan's comment earlier, quite a change from where we were during the pandemic years. And certainly that sort of silence, I think, was applauded by most directors. I mean, we kept asking about this in our What Directors Think report and in the Director Confidence Index. They just kind of want the companies to stick with only things that directly relate to their mission and stay silent on everything else. And so, kind of noteworthy how things shift back and forth from year to year. Speaking of that, though, we had quite a lot happening in the news cycle this year. So, Megan, maybe I'll start with you. What was your top ripped from the headlines governance story of 2024?
Yeah, it actually relates to what we were just discussing, Dottie. And that is the end of DEI. I sent my picks last week to Kira, and this being one of them. And funny enough, pop open my email this morning, and one of the first things in my inbox is the Director of Board's newsletter that comes out every morning. And the subject line, the end of DEI. So, still talking about it and have been talking about it for most of this year. Could be, sort of sparked by the Supreme Court striking down affirmative action in college admissions, the political environment, and the divisiveness happening in this country that we just talked about. But it really, I think, all of that sparked an interesting backlash to the embrace of diversity, equity, and inclusion that I personally was not expecting. And I think a real, 180 in a lot of ways from what we saw in 2020 and 2021, similar to, the previous support around ESG, around political activity proposals, things that we just talked about. And also, I think in light of the business case for DEI seeming to get stronger and stronger. Just about a year ago, McKinsey published an exceptional report on the business case for diversity that found that companies in the top quartile for ethnic diversity and leadership outperform those in the bottom quartile by 39%. When you look at board diversity, something we've talked about at length here on this show, the same study found that companies in the top quartile for ethnically diverse board members are 13% more likely to outperform boards in the bottom quartile. But when you look at what happened in 2024, the number of US companies sort of curtailing or rolling back their diversity initiatives, it's kind of staggering. And, a lot of it is because of pressure from a single activist, this guy, Robbie Starbuck, who I personally had no idea who he was until recently. A couple of things to note here. In June, he began campaigning on social media against companies unpopular with conservatives because of DEI, support around LGBTQ plus activities, climate change, other sort of social policies. He focused on one company at a time. He posted dozens and dozens of times, urging his followers to protest with both their voices and their wallets. And, he seemed to get a lot of attention. Tractor Supply, first company to roll back their initiatives. John Deere announced they would no longer sponsor social or cultural awareness events, would audit all of its training materials. In August, Harley Davidson, Brown Forman, Lowe's, Ford, all of them rolled back several DE&I initiatives and ended their respective relationships with the Human Rights Campaign. Just a couple of weeks ago, Molson Coors, Caterpillar, Toyota, similar things. It's very, very interesting to me. And we're seeing it similarly in the boardroom too. For a long time, we talked about, getting the numbers about boardroom diversity up, 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 and saw great progress in 2020, 2021. But seeing a dip again. In 2023, it was about 36% of new board members were from an underrepresented minority. This year, about 26%. And I think there's a lot of sentiment that that will continue to recede in 2025. I mentioned it before, but I think if you've listened to any past episode of the podcast, one, it's a topic we discussed at length here, but it's one that I am, from a DE&I perspective, I am a very staunch supporter of it, both at the operational and the board level. So I don't know. I am feeling disheartened by this sort of cycle here, but also I think time will be the judge, and how much of this is um, response to a single investor or a small portion of their shareholders and stakeholders versus maybe how things might play out over the long term.
Well, Megan, that's a really great article and great story to bring forth. And I would say, it also strikes me how different this story is in the US than it is elsewhere in the world. Because one of the things that we've definitely been seeing, especially in boardrooms in the EU in particular, is the increase in gender parity. In part because of laws that have been put into place in places like France and Italy and even Ireland now. There's a parity law for corporate boardrooms that there must be 40% representation of female directors. Those laws are having a real impact, and they're gaining in popularity instead of waning in popularity. And so I think you're right that it will be very interesting to see in retrospect what impact things have had from one place to another. But you're right; it is disheartening to see companies rolling back in response to basically one source of pressure. Now granted that source of pressure might be very effective, but it is a bit disheartening. TK, any thoughts on the ripped from the headlines?
First of all, Megan, I thought that was interesting statistics there. At some point in time, that number of new minorities will go down because you'll sort of peak and you'll have boards that have done a very good job, which I think they've done in the last couple of years. Every board recruiting, chair of the nominating committee was looking for, a minority candidate last couple of years. So, but I really don't think that it would have peaked yet. Okay, even though I know those numbers have to at some point start going down just because they've done a good job. But my headline is really sort of different. It has a stretch to governance, but it was when you opened the paper and found out that the CrowdStrike defective software brought the nation down. Okay, and it just was a sort of a shot across the bow, and added to me just a even higher level of risk, that boards have to think about on how easy it was to disrupt, business and take airlines down for the day and sort of bring our country in a lot of areas to a standstill. So that to me was a pretty significant, you know, sort of event and what was happening. And there's obviously a lot of that gets magnified by the geopolitical risk and what's happening with Russia and Iran and whatever, and China, and you just think about, geez, it doesn't sound like it's real tough to attack the infrastructure. So um, it just adds another level of sort of the complexity to people trying to think of the black swan events that can impact their company.
I think that was a really good choice, TK, because you're right. I mean, the CrowdStrike attack was huge, and it did take down so many different businesses, and also, excuse me, I think also just sort of showed some of the vulnerabilities in the infrastructure. So not just what nation actors are doing, but just how vulnerable a lot of infrastructure really was. So I think it was a very important story. My ripped from the headlines moment sort of follows TK nicely. Um, maybe mine isn't quite as sensationalist, but I am a bigger nerd really than either of the other two of my co-hosts here. So for me, it was about the impact of the SEC's cyber disclosure rules. There was so much hand wringing happening in the wake of that ruling last fall. And I think so many companies were really concerned about what is this going to mean and how are we going to keep up with this and how do we determine materiality of an incident and what if something like CrowdStrike impacts thousands of companies? Do we all have to disclose it? Like, how do we determine this? And it was really interesting. I just saw an article from last month in the Wall Street Journal that did a recap on, okay, so what was the impact? And it turns out everyone's fine. It did not negatively impact anybody's stock price. It did not cool performance for any company. Everybody's fine. They all handled their disclosures. It's okay. The one thing that did happen, though, is the level of personal liability on the heads of chief information security officers is way up. And people are looking at what's happening, for example, at the CISO of CrowdStrike and other things like that, sort of what's happening with the whole SolarWinds debacle. And they're really paying close attention to how do we do a better job of providing legal protections for our CISOs so that we can retain good ones. And that has been a topic of conversation in some boardrooms. The concern about the ability to hire top talent for these chief information security officer roles and CIO roles, knowing that there is a much bigger bullseye on their back if things go wrong. And it's one of these things I always reflect on, and it always makes me just so frustrated and a little mad. I'm not saying that some of these individuals don't deserve liability. Some of them did some boneheaded things. There's no question. But frankly, it frustrates me to no end that the only thing we can do right now when companies are attacked by cyber attackers is blame the company. It just really bothers me. I mean, they are the victims, and yet those are the people we're holding accountable. That's who we put regulation in place to deal with, not the criminals. And I hate everything about that. I don't have a solve for it. I just want to share my frustration. Do you guys agree? Frustrates me to no end.
Well, I mean, to a level. I mean, when I run into boards that um, haven't even had discussions about uh, protecting the family jewels, okay, and they have no distribution of how they're going to spend money to protect the most important things. I just think to myself, you know, have you been living under a rock? Kind of, you know. And then, I don't get as sympathetic, but I do. Nobody can figure out this cyber stuff, so it's tough to get too upset. Until somebody says, "Hey, you're really doing something fraudulent in the way of exposing yourself." So, yeah, I don't I choose to get upset about other things, but, I can understand why that would bother you, yes.
Well, you have a much better perspective on life, TK, than I do. No, I mean, listen, I don't mean in any way, shape, or form to say that I think companies should be absolved of their responsibility. Of course not. They need to do the right things, and the ones that are not doing the right things deserve whatever acrimony falls on their heads. I fully agree with that. I guess what I'm saying is, I wish we could hold the criminals accountable. I guess that's really what I'm saying. And they're so hard to catch. They're so good at this, and we have to be right 100% of the time. They only have to be right once. And they're right once and all hell breaks loose. I think that's the part that I feel the frustration about. And anyway, so I thought it was kind of an interesting recap. All right. Well, so then let's go on to our top governance reads, shows, podcasts, events of the year. TK, do you want to kick this one off? What was your favorite pick of the year?
Okay, so when you gave me either show or podcast or whatever, I actually went to the Modern Board, which is the content that's put out by the Fortune Diligent relationship. And they had in one of the newsletters article on how the CEO board collaboration can address the increased complexities of governance, which for me hit on developing the culture of the board, which has always been one of my favorite topics. And it's always before last year, it was always sort of a soft topic. But the article talked about building the right culture, a culture of trust and respect, having a good board process, for dealing with critical issues that come up. And then something that I harped about, for many years while I was in business is the better CEO and board communication. So that for me was something that caught my attention. That's why I picked that for this year.
I love that, and that's a perennial topic that is always super important. Megan, what was your top pick?
Come with me on this journey. So I was really racking my brain for something appropriate. But let's be honest, I am the mother of a 2-year-old. It is it is her world. I am just living in it. And I consume a lot of media for work for my job, but nothing has quite had the foothold on me this year than Sesame Street. So come with me as I talk about some lessons to be learned from Sesame Street.
Brought to you by the letter G for governance.
Exactly, exactly. We laugh though, but I mean, the show has been around for 55 years. Wrapped around it is a truly global nonprofit that started shortly after the show premiered. I mean, this beats the S&P average age of an organization by like a solid 30 years. As Jim Collins would say, this Sesame Street is built to last, man. And I think there's a few things, there's a few lessons here. One is really about knowing your audience. And that goes for both parents and children. I watched and loved the show as a child, and it truly brings me so much joy to watch my daughter love it just as much as I did. They're so acutely attuned to the needs and interests of kids and parents. And that's really by design. I mean, way back in 1969, they took a different approach right out the gate. Unlike other kids' TV shows at the time, they went and did research and did experiments to create a show that added value and helped kids learn in a different way. And they've basically created an entirely new model, the children's television workshop model it's called, about planning, production, evaluation, of creating a TV show that goes alongside with the expertise of researchers, of early childhood education specialists, alongside the writers, the directors, and so forth. So in its, I think, unique approach to how it creates something, I think important too is it's unwavering in its mission and values, which is to help children everywhere grow smarter, stronger, and kinder. You hear them say it at the beginning of every Sesame Street episode. Um, and I think with that is this other idea that you can stay true to who you are as an organization, to your mission and values as the world changes around you. You just have to embrace that change and evolve with it. The Sesame Street of 1969 looks a lot different than it does today, but there's something intrinsically there that just feels the same. And I think back to even some of the earlier conversations today, over the last few years, this idea of sort of corporate purpose, what are we all doing here, has been really front and center in boardrooms. And, companies have taken a few different directions as of late, but I think there's something in the magic of Sesame Street that companies should really take note of.
I love this analogy, Megan, and I'm watching TK's face as you're talking about this, and I'm thinking, as a new grandpa, he might have watched a fair few episodes of Sesame Street recently. Is that a true statement, TK?
Well, listen, the reason I was smiling is that launched when I was in college. So I didn't have the benefit, unless I watched it, one day, after a marijuana cigarette in the fraternity house. But, my kids obviously had the benefit of that. And it was something that, again, TV is not supposed to be the greatest babysitter, for kids, but it gave you some comfort. and everything was always well done. I mean, I never looked into it or thought about it at the depth that you just espoused, but I'm sure there's lessons, just like the Disney movies. A lot of times, there's lessons incorporated in that. I remember when Aladdin, came out. I thought it was almost an adult movie. It had such humor and lessons that were involved in it. So I buy. I was surprised, but I buy your.
Well done, Megan. All right, mine's going to be so much more boring after that. I mean, for me, I'm going to go with two live experiences that I had this year, both of which were straight down the road of garden variety governance, but both very impactful. The first was our own Elevate Leadership Summit that we did on September 9th this year as part of the Elevate conference. We pulled together some incredible speakers, and there's two sessions that really stood out for me. One was about financial fraud and abuse, because we had both the whistleblower and a former audit committee board member on the supervisory board of Wirecard. And you could have heard a pin drop in the room as they told their story. And their story was truly harrowing. I mean, they were getting legitimate death threats. They were being followed. Their families were being followed and surveilled. It was just an incredible nightmare scenario. But they shared how they made it through. And the quote that stands out to me as the most just pin drop quote was from Anastasia Lauterbach, who was a member of the audit committee. She was working from the inside to try to bring the scandal to light. And she gave advice to everyone in the room, which is these days when people call her and ask how to get on a board, and should they join a board, she has one response, and that is think very hard about whether or not you would have the stomach to fire the CEO. And if the answer is no, don't join the board, which is such a sobering comment, but honestly is really true. The work that board members have to do is very, very challenging. And if you don't think you've got the stomach for it, you don't really want to join the board. It's not a good idea. I think also it really speaks to the fact that in her case, the CEO was committing fraud. So just to put it in context, not that you should fire every CEO, but that know that you have the stomach to do it if it is necessary, and know that you will do it if it is necessary and you won't hesitate. I think that's really incredibly salient advice. The other event that I went to this year, it was actually just 2 weeks ago. I was up in Cambridge at a program called Becoming a More Digitally Savvy Board Member, run by MIT's Center for Information Systems Research, CISR. I was invited to be a guest lecturer there as part of that program. And they revealed their updated research on what it means to have digitally savvy board members on your board. And they have a model that they created for what does digital savviness mean. And what they found, they've done this study now twice, once in 2019 and once again this year. And what they have learned is if you have one digitally savvy board member, it doesn't do anything. If you have two, it really doesn't do much. Once you have three, those companies with boards that have three or more digitally savvy board members outperform everyone by like 30 plus percentage points. It's like a huge hockey stick. And what they think is happening there, and this kind of goes back to your comment about diversity, equity, and inclusion, Megan. When you have one person, that person can't really make much headway with change. Two people can support each other, but probably can't get beyond the status quo. But three people becomes a conversation. And it's very hard to ignore that conversation. And they can actually have a real impact on steering where the company goes and the kinds of decisions that are made. And so I really found that research to be so important and so salient, especially as we continue down this road of AI development and fast technological innovation. Companies need to be forward looking and future oriented. And a lot of boards are just not there. They don't have the talent they need to really push forward in these innovative ways. So I thought that was really very, very interesting. Okay. We have our final bonus question, and this is one we played with last year. What is our governance Roman Empire? And of course, this came from last year's meme about men always thinking about the Roman Empire, and so we sort of thought that was funny. So we wanted to do a governance Roman Empire, and that is any governance-related event or concept that you find yourself thinking about all the time, maybe way too much, and it's anything that you feel other people don't think about as often as you do. and you get bonus points if it's really niche. So, TK, what is your governance Roman Empire?
Well, first of all, I had to figure out this because I wasn't trendy enough to understand that this was a meme last year and whatever, but I was educated on this, and I can tell you that as a male, I hadn't thought about the Roman Empire. The last time was probably when I saw the movie Gladiator. Okay, so I don't regularly think of it, like what happened in the Roman Empire. But my answer to this is the thing that I probably think about way, way more than maybe even people should, but maybe then they don't. They should think about it a little more, and that is thinking about when they recruit a director, who potentially can serve as a chair of a board committee. Board committees have turned out to be such an important part of a board's ability to get through its responsibilities and its duties that, and particularly in the areas of um, compensation and obviously audit. And I think people do think about audit, but I don't think they think about comp as much as they should. I'm making sure that we can get people into those board chair positions that can carry the load and that understand the intricacies of being the chair of a committee. So when somebody's recruiting somebody, it's not just so they would be a nice addition, but who is going to be your leaders going down the in the future. So that would be my Roman Empire sort of issue.
I love that. Megan, what is your Roman Empire governance style?
Yeah, mine is a little bit more nebulous and more sort of future oriented, but in the same vein of like popping into my head on a daily basis. Um, and it could be because we ask all of our guests, where will boardrooms be 10 years from now? The nature of our job at Diligent. I spend way, way too much time thinking about the death of board meetings and board books. Like, I think it's all gonna be gone really soon.
Megan, I'm going to double down on yours because mine is similar. Mine is similar, but I'm going to maybe amplify it and then we can talk about it. So here's the thing. I've been thinking about this. I'm not kidding you, for at least the last 15 years. And I even wrote a book about this. And that is, why haven't board meetings changed faster? Like, I don't understand why board work is still stuck in this model that frankly started with the Bank of England in 1684. Boards still do this thing called deliberate, which means slow. We have so many tools now. Every company is data driven. Every company runs on real time data. And yet board meetings don't. They are notorious for having very carefully curated, lengthy slide decks full of data that's at least a week or a month old. And I don't understand why board members as a body haven't risen up and demanded better. They deserve better. They could make better decisions if they had better visibility on what the heck was actually going on at the company. And not to get in management's way, not to step on management's toes, but to help management see around the corner. I mean, that's their most important function, to have that insight and that foresight in addition to oversight, right? And so how can they do that if everything they're reading and everything they're receiving from the company is old, carefully curated? I mean, it's just ridiculous. We don't live in that world anymore. We haven't lived in that world for over a decade. So for me, the thing I think about all the time is, why are we still here? And honestly, I thought during the pandemic, when suddenly everybody had to jump onto Zoom board meetings, it was going to accelerate and we were going to finally get over this hurdle and change what board meeting, quote unquote, actually means. But we didn't. We just put the exact same thing we'd always been doing online. It just really kind of baffles me. I think we are very ripe for a complete overhaul in what a board meeting actually means, and really changing what happens, when it happens, how people interact and communicate with each other, how they get smarter about what's happening in the company. I think the whole thing is ripe for an overhaul. What do you think, TK?
Well, I'll push back just a little bit. I had the chance last year to moderate and facilitate two sort of board CEO type panels, and the directors on both of those panels said we're pushing that they wanted no death by, you know, slide decks, by PowerPoint. And, they wanted to make sure that the meetings were substantive and whatever. Now, I will concur with you that that has not happened at a lot of places. Okay. But I think, and it's like the government, when you make, when you ask for those changes, it takes a while for the ship to turn. Okay. But I truly believe that there are a lot of people that feel the way that you do, that the meetings have to be changed. And it's just a process that's going to take a little time and get the directors on board. So I'd like to believe that the more savvy directors are pushing, for that to change. But it's not just that. It's not just slide decks. It's not just old stuff. Meetings still, nobody's looking at it creatively enough, okay, to say, how can we enhance this even further and change this sort of the dynamic that happens? And there was some change during the pandemic because it was a forced change of doing things electronically, whatever. But I don't think that necessarily helped because I think that without seeing the expressions and some of the conversations just weren't the same. But anyway, I think somebody, I mean, everybody's trying. Look at, even our own Diligent here is, working hard with their snapshots and their, things that can speed up the process of what's happening and how decisions are made and how information is received and stuff. But it hasn't changed it that much.
All right. So that leaves us with our final conversation that we have at the end of your show, and that is what is going to be the hottest governance trend or story to watch in 2025. TK, why don't you take this first?
Yeah, baby. This is where we sort of separate the men from the boys. So excuse that expression, ladies. But um, my number one topic for 2025 is Trumpism. Okay.
Dun, dun,
There
dun.
it is gonna be amazing, okay, as he changes all this stuff. Think of a global company that's gonna have to peel back in the US, but to your point, Dottie, when you talked about overseas is gonna have no changes, okay, to the requirements and you're aboard sitting in the middle of that discussion, or you're an accounting firm, okay, one of the big four that has to balance where do you go when you're servicing companies that are on both sides of the pond. And it's just the whole event that's going to happen, a new SEC chair and peeling back environmental issues and changing all that. It's just going to put a board in a unbelievably complex situation, added on to AI, added on to cyber, added on. So, um, everybody talks about each year being subsequently more challenging and complex. Well, you're going to be about to add another layer of complexity to the issue, and that's trying to balance everything that's going to be changing in the US, but not necessarily changing in your other markets overseas.
I think that's a great pick, TK. And now I want to change my answer.
Well, mine is in a similar vein. I think will we see more Californias when it comes to regulations that impact business? Think about climate issues. I've had a lot of conversations recently, as I'm sure most of us have, around the election. When it comes to climate disclosure requirements, everyone's like, well, the SEC rulings, DOA, that's not going to happen. But then immediately everyone goes, well, there's still California. And I think it'll be interesting to see if we start to see other states take some strong action to keep some of those principles in place.
I think that's a good bet. I'm going to give you both an A already. Preemptive A's for the end of the year because I think you're both right. I mean, I can't get my head out of the AI rut. So my pick for 2025 is I really do think 2025 may be the year where we actually start to see things evolving in boardrooms, and it's going to be all fueled by AI. I really do think this is the year that more boards get their hands on a different way of getting smart, of getting insight, of understanding patterns within their company that the humans just can't see. AI can find things in ways that we can't see them. It can unearth what's important and take bias out. I know we always talk about AI putting bias in, but sometimes AI can take bias out because we are biased. When we look at data, we tend to gravitate to the data that we already agree with and kind of subconsciously or sometimes consciously ignore the data we don't agree with. And so I think we're going to see some changes happening in boardrooms this year fueled by AI in lots of really interesting and innovative ways. It won't be necessarily widespread to start, but I think some of the biggest companies will do it first and we'll learn from them. And I think we'll probably see a fair number of articles written about how things are changing for them as a result. I also just don't want to talk about Trumpism. But I think you're both right.
It's an interesting pick, Dottie. I'd be curious to get the perspective of not a board member who I think would agree with you or want that, but maybe a general counsel, chief legal officer, and see how they're feeling about implementing AI policies in their organization.
Oh, I'm pretty sure they're not feeling so great about it. I'm pretty sure they're feeling pretty tense about it because honestly, I talked about the carefully curated board deck, and that is usually the job of the corporate secretary or the general counsel for good reason, right? They want to keep things on the straight and narrow, make sure the data is correct. I mean, I get it. I just think if I'm a board member, I'm sick to death of it because I don't actually know what's happening because everything I get is old. And so I think it's going to be very interesting to see what can change when you're not just getting lengthy reports, you're actually getting insights about those lengthy reports created by a non-human. And you're then beginning to see things like, how often have we talked about this issue in the boardroom? And what's been the results the last time we talked about this in the boardroom? And, did anything actually change? Are we just talking about the same issue, but nothing ever changes? Can we go back and see, how often do we make decisions around this particular area? And what was the financial performance the last time we did? I mean, I think there's a lot of opportunity here to use AI in really clever ways for boards and senior leadership teams to get smarter. And I think they're all chomping at the bit to do it. So I think 2025 may be a year that we start to see some pretty big differences. And when we look back at the end of next year, we might really see some big differences.
So our picks aren't risky, but yours is. You haven't. Yours is either feast or famine. Okay, we'll see. Well, might be a little anxious by the time we meet again next year.
We will see. Well, I think that wraps up our end of year episode of the Corporate Director Podcast, The Voice of Modern Governance. Again, I'm Dottie Schindlinger, and I've been joined by my two fantabulous co-hosts, TK Kerstetter and Meghan Day. I'd like to say a few special thank yous, including to our podcast producer, Kira Ciccarelli, the team at Oxenfree for making this podcast a reality, and most especially, Diligent Corporation for sponsoring this show. Happy holidays, everyone, and we'll see you in the new year.
Happy holidays.
You've been listening to the Corporate Director Podcast. To ensure that you never miss an episode, subscribe to the show in your favorite podcast player. If you'd like to learn more about corporate governance and tools to help directors do their job better, visit www.diligent.com. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.